Dear friends, dear readers, dear YouTube followers, welcome in Arouca Press YouTube channel. My name is Gaetano Masciullo. I am a historian and philosopher, freelance journalist, and together we'll have a look through the rich offerings of Arouca Press, exploring works by great authors in its catalog. And as you know, Arouca Press is a Catholic publisher committed publishing both new and out-of-print gems to aid in reinvigorating the intellectual and devotional life of Catholics in every state of life. And today we have the honor of speaking with Joseph Pearce. Thank you, Joseph, to be here with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Joseph Pearce is an English author and scholar known for his books on the literature and faith, global lectures, media work, and academic roles. And he wrote the foreword for one of Arouca Press' most recent titles, The Day Shakespeare Died. Let me show the cover of this book. Of course, you can find this book on Arouca Press website, www.aroucapress.com. And you can also visit the website of Joseph Pearce, as you can read below, jpearce.co. And you can find all the infos in the description too. So, Joseph, tell us more about your interest in this topic. Where did it come from?
So yes, when I first moved to the United States about 25 years or so ago, I had a colleague at Ave Maria University on the literature faculty of Ave Maria University who was convinced that Shakespeare was a Catholic. And I thought that was merely wishful thinking on his part, and that there was not enough evidence for us to know about Shakespeare's Catholicism, whether he was Catholic or not. But then I started studying the issue, and the more I studied the issue of Shakespeare's faith, the more it became evident to me that we could know beyond any reasonable doubt that Shakespeare was indeed a believing Catholic in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. And of course, that's at a time when the Catholic Church is illegal, when it's punishable by death to be a priest, punishable by death to hide a priest from the authorities, a refusal to conform to the state religion established by Henry VIII and continued by Elizabeth I was a crime, and you were punished by being fined or exiled or imprisoned for refusing to conform to the state religion. And Catholic recusants, those who refused to conform, suffered. So Shakespeare is part of this culture, this Catholic, if you like, underground culture that's going on at the time. And when I was looking for evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism and finding it in multifarious places, one of the places I found it was in this wonderful book, The Day Shakespeare Died by Hugh Ross Williamson, which Arouca Press has now, thanks be to God, brought back into print so that other people can read the wonderful scholarship that Hugh Ross Williamson did on this very topic.
Yeah, I see. Could you briefly talk about the life of Hugh Ross Williamson?
Yes, so I'm writing a series at the moment for Crisis magazine called The Unsung Heroes of Christendom, basically about the heroes of Catholicism throughout the centuries, from the earliest times to the present times, that are not as well known as they should be. And I've actually included Hugh Ross Williamson in this series as one of the unsung heroes of Christendom, because he was very famous in the 1940s and 1950s, and indeed the early 1960s. As one of the original sort of talking heads on TV, the first generation of television celebrities, if you like, but he was also much more than that. He wrote novels and plays and works of non-fiction, and specifically, actually, quite a few very good works of what we might call revisionist history, basically uncovering the deceptions of what Hilaire Belloc called tomfool Protestant history, the distorted view of English history that's been passed down to us, does not concur with the facts of history. So he became Hugh Ross Williamson, a very good and very important historian, especially actually of the 16th and early 17th century, and of course this work, The Day Shakespeare Died, is part of that legacy he's left us.
So, what is the importance of this book?
Well, so what we have to understand is that Shakespeare died in 1616 at a time when England was slowly turning against Catholicism. And Shakespeare really, probably at least partly, maybe even primarily because of his Catholicism, fell into neglect. And, you know, for about over 100 years, for about 150 years, Shakespeare was not really performed or studied or read or written about very much. And then in the mid 1700s, the mid 18th century, there was a Shakespeare revival. And so when the Shakespeare revival came, then Shakespeare's Catholicism was conveniently forgotten, brushed under the carpet. So we have this mysterious figure of William Shakespeare, whose real past is not being spoken about because of its Catholicism. And so you have this blank page, this tabula rasa, Shakespeare's biography, which people have written all sorts of fantastical, unbelievable things on, including various claims that Shakespeare didn't write the plays at all, but other people did. And this is, I think, a consequence of the fact that Shakespeare's deepest held beliefs, his Catholic beliefs, were now undesirable and basically cancelled, to use modern terminology, had been cancelled by British culture and by British history. So then it was not until the 1800s that early scholars such as Richard Simpson started doing research and uncovering the evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. And this became an ongoing movement of scholarship. In my own book, The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon and the Church of Rome, was a gathering together of all of this, as much of this evidence as I could find, and as a sort of compendium of facts, putting it in one book so people don't have to do what I did and hunt all sorts of out-of-print books looking for the evidence. All the evidence I collected, I put in one book, which people can read. But one of the important books that I did read as part of my research was Hugh Ross Williamson's book, The Day Shakespeare Died. So I am indebted to him personally in my own research and writing for his scholarship on Shakespeare's Catholicism. And again, I'm pleased that now that book is back in print so that people can actually get it and read it for themselves rather than just have to read what I say about it and the few quotes I take from it, or else sort of hunt in secondhand bookshops for an old out of print edition. Now there's this brand new edition that Arouca Press have published. Thanks be to God for that, and I hope people will go out and read it because it's a great and very important book of scholarship on Shakespeare's Catholicism.
I'm curious. Can you give us examples of evidences of a Shakespeare Catholic faith in his works, and how can we understand that the Christian faith, which is in his works, are not of Anglican confession?
Yeah, that's a great question, an important one. The first thing I would have to say is I have written 3 books on the subject, and a large chunk of my recent book, Classic Literature Made Simple, is about, I think I cover about at least 7, maybe 12 of the plays in that. But my 2 main books are The Quest for Shakespeare and Through Shakespeare's Eyes. Now, The Quest for Shakespeare looks at the biographical and historical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. The Through Shakespeare's Eyes looks at the textual evidence from the plays, the sonnets, and the poems. So these 2 different approaches, the biographical and textual, form what I call metaphorically a Gothic arch, that each supports the other. The biographical evidence supports the evidence from the plays, and the evidence from the play supports the biographical evidence. It's mutually supporting. So what I'll do briefly to answer your question, after prefacing it with the fact that that there's so much that I can't possibly obviously try to give all the evidence in a short interview, but I'll give one example of historical evidence, biographical evidence, from my book, The Quest for Shakespeare, and then one example of textual evidence. So the biographical evidence, I think that what the most dramatic piece of biographical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism is that almost the last thing he does before he retires and leaves London in about 1612, 1613, he purchases the Blackfriars Gatehouse in London. The Blackfriars Gatehouse, as its name would suggest, was the gatehouse to Blackfriars. The Blackfriars, of course, are the Dominicans. And that religious house was destroyed by Henry VIII, along with all the other monasteries and religious houses in England. But the gatehouse remained as a private residence. So from the period of the dissolution of the monasteries at the end of the 1530s through when Shakespeare purchased it in about 1612. So a period of say, shall we say, 75 years or so. That house had remained, and we know this from the property deeds, that house had remained in the hands of Catholics, and not just Catholics, but recusant Catholics, Catholics who were defiant in refusing to conform to the state religion. And that house, the Blackfriars Gatehouse, was a known center for underground Catholic activities. It was raided by the authorities on more than one occasion. There are reports about secret passageways leading down to the River Thames, so that if the house is raided, priests or whoever's staying there that wants to escape can escape on the river. So this is the house that Shakespeare purchases. But when he purchases it, he stipulates he's not living himself. He's leaving London. He's moving back to Stratford-upon-Avon to live with his family. So he's purchasing it not as a personal residence. What he stipulates is that the present tenant, the person who's the tenant there, before he buys it, should remain the tenant. This person's name is John Robinson. John Robinson is a close friend of Shakespeare, a known Catholic. Obviously the house is used in the same way as the center of Catholic activity after Shakespeare purchases it, as had been done before. John Robinson is one of the closest of Shakespeare's London friends. He's the only one of Shakespeare's London friends who's with Shakespeare during his final illness and signs his will. And what's really intriguing is that in the same year that Shakespeare purchases the Blackfriars Gatehouse, John Robinson's brother enters the English college in Rome to study for the priesthood. So this one piece of evidence from Shakespeare's life. As for the plays, there's so much evidence that it's difficult to know where to start. But let's take Hamlet. That the famous graveyard scene in Hamlet, the famous "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him" Horatio speech with the skull. A large part of that scene is a dialogue with St. Robert Southwell's poem Upon the Image of Death. Now, St. Robert Southwell was a Jesuit who was arrested in 1592, spent 3 years imprisonment, being tortured in the Tower of London and other places before being martyred, executed by being hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1595. This is the period that Shakespeare's writing, of course. Hamlet's probably written about 4 or 5 years after the martyrdom of St. Robert Southwell. St. Robert Southwell is, that's spelled Southwell, by the way, for people that want to check it out for himself, but it's normally pronounced Southwell. He was a poet, and Shakespeare alludes to St. Robert Southwell's poetry and writing in several of his own poems and plays. So I've just taken one example. But if you could compare and contrast St. Robert Southwell's poem Upon the Image of Death with the scene from Hamlet, where Hamlet is pondering, if you like, the image of death, but looking at the skull, this memento mori, this reminder of death, which for Catholics should always be the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. That's the topic of both the poem and the scene in the play. And you can see how Shakespeare intertextually is in conversation with this great Jesuit martyr.
Interesting. Even though someone might say maybe, okay, Shakespeare quoted a Jesuit, but the peculiar element of Catholicism, especially in that time, regarded the devotion to papacy, right? So I wonder whether we can find references to this devotion in his works. I understand that if we put ourselves in Shakespeare clothes, he could not speak clearly about the Pope because of the laws in that time. But maybe concealed images, references about the Pope.
Yeah, well, I don't know about the Pope per se, but let me give you an example also from Hamlet, the end of Hamlet, that when after Hamlet's death, right at the end of the play, that his great friend Horatio quotes the lines, "May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest," which is a translation from the Latin of the traditional Latin Requiem Mass, said over the body of obviously a Catholic. This mass is illegal in England. So Shakespeare, if you like, concludes at the end of Hamlet with giving his hero a Catholic burial. And again, this is an allusion to that within his sonnets. There's a wonderful one of the best definitions of the mass I've ever seen. Bear in mind, the mass is illegal in England, right? In one of his sonnets, he talks about the perfect ceremony of love's rite, R-I-T-E. Now, I can't think of a better definition of the mass than the perfect ceremony of love's rite. And if you read the whole sonnet, what he's lamenting is he does not attend the perfect ceremony of love's rite as often as he should because of fear. Now, we have to understand is, that when mass was being celebrated by priests, very likely there would be spies, Queen Elizabeth's or King James's spies amongst the congregation, fake converts that would report who was there at the mass and what have you. So it was a dangerous business to attend mass.
Yeah, of course.
And because Shakespeare's saying that in that sonnet that he doesn't go to mass as often as he would like. And then he says at the end of that sonnet, I can't remember the exact quote now, that may my writing basically speak for the silence that I have to keep in other respects. In other words, he's inviting us to see in his works evidence of the Catholicism that he can't practice or speak about openly.
Yeah, of course.
There's another sonnet, by the way, where he talks about more than that, which has more expressed. And again, within the context of that particular sonnet, that's in one of those mores is quite clearly a pun on the martyr St. Thomas More. So yeah, I mean, I could carry on, but there's all sorts of textual evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism from his works, as well as, again, abundance of evidence from his life.
I see. There are a lot of references to Italy in Shakespeare works. And, there is a theory according to which Shakespeare was not actually British, but Italian. I don't know if you ever heard about this theory. The actual name should be Guglielmo Scrollalanza. I don't have a position about that. What do you think about this theory?
Well, as I said, that because of Shakespeare's Catholicism, there was a period of time where he was neglected for about almost 150 years, and then when he was rediscovered, his Catholicism was left unmentioned. So we have 250 years, which leaves us with a tabula rasa, a blank page, a blank slate, upon which people are writing their own theories. One of the reasons that this book by Hugh Ross Williamson is so important is to actually give the solid historical, biographical evidence and textual evidence for who Shakespeare was, in order to dispel this nonsense. I mean, the fact that he's Italian is one thing. The fact that he's the Earl of Oxford or Francis Bacon or someone. There are even people think that Shakespeare's wife wrote the plays. There are other theories that that Queen Elizabeth I wrote the plays. It gets sillier and sillier. So to me, this is about as credible as about the 30 years or so after Elvis Presley died. There were Elvis Presley sightings around the world. He didn't really die, and that someone spotted him in Texas. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's like it's just it's not worth taking seriously. But what we do need in order to dispel the nonsense is good, solid scholarship. And this new book that Arouca Press brought back into print, Hugh Ross Williamson's The Day Shakespeare Died, is part of that evidence which we need to dispel the nonsense.
Right. How was this book received in its time?
Yeah, I mean, what you have to understand is there's a whole Shakespeare industry, and there's a huge number of people whose reputations, academic reputations particularly, are riding on false readings of Shakespeare based upon the ignorance of 250 years of not discussing this solid evidence. So there was obviously going to be hostility from many people in the academy to an understanding of Shakespeare, which was complete loggerheads with their own secularist or relativist or Protestant readings of it, all sorts of other nonsense, homosexual readings, all sorts of things. So when we start bringing up evidence for Shakespeare's Catholic faith and how this Catholic faith informs his works, then that's obviously something which is going to be seen as a threat. So there was pushback, there was hostility. And the thing about Hugh Ross Williamson, which I admire, that, you know, for me, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants in my own research of Shakespeare. It's not as if I'm discovering anything new. I'm presenting what's been discovered by others in one book, to make it simple. But Hugh Ross Williamson was a pioneer. He was at the, if you like, on the front line of this. So in the middle of the 20th century, the 1950s and 1960s, to say that Shakespeare was Catholic made you sort of very much part of the avant-garde, and a very, very not unpopular avant-garde. So Hugh Ross Williamson suffered actually a lot of persecution for his Catholicism, particularly for his no-nonsense, should we say, tradition-oriented Catholicism that was not happy with modernist tendencies in the church, but also for his scholarship about Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and specifically about his scholarship on Shakespeare's Catholicism. So he made himself unpopular. He lost positions on television because of his Catholic faith and because of the scholarship that was inspired by his Catholic faith. So, you know, we can see him not just as an unsung hero of Christendom, but as a persecuted Catholic in modern times. And so this work of his, I think, he suffered for his writing of it, his publishing of it, and his defense of it.
Are there Marian references in Shakespeare works? Because this is another element of distinction between Catholicism and Anglicanism, which there is in Anglican confession devotion to saints, but not in the same way as in Catholicism, right?
Yes. So, I mean, the first thing you have to realize, of course, is that what's confusing and confused about Anglicanism is it could not really ever make up its mind whether it was a sort of a protesting form of Catholicism or whether it was actually Protestant. So you have, you know, these two strands.
A middle road, right?
Yeah, well, that's what they aim for, the via media, but that's not what they have. What they have is schizophrenia, right? You actually have they have the so-called high church, which not until the 19th century, but by the 19th century it starts to become known as the Anglo-Catholicism. And you have the low church that are basically Calvinist Protestants. So you have, you know, the two mutually incompatible theologies trying to coexist within the same religious communion, right? So this is, of course, because of its founding. Henry VIII was basically a Catholic who, for Machiavellian reasons, made himself head of the church. But of course, then for political reasons, it became good for the Anglican Church to, should we say, come to terms with Protestantism. So, and because the Anglican Church was the only permitted religion, the state religion was the only religion that was permitted, that if you wanted to be a Protestant, you could be a Protestant within the state religion. If you had Catholic sensibilities, as long as you didn't show loyalty to the Catholic Church in Rome, the global Catholic Church, you could still practice as if it's sort of a sacrament. So you have this sort of schizophrenia within what Anglicanism is. So that adds to the confusion, right? So for instance, the Anglican churches, in more than any other country in the world, this is my understanding from research I've done, that there are more churches dedicated to the Blessed Virgin in England, because it's the medieval times, of course, and St. Mary's, just called St. Mary's, not Our Lady, St. Mary's or St. Mary the Virgin. But the English had such a devotion to the Blessed Virgin in the Middle Ages that, again, that is by far the most common dedication for Catholic churches in England prior to the Reformation was St. Mary's. Now, this continues. In other words, they don't change the names of the churches. So these Anglican churches still known as St. Mary's Church and what have you. And so within Shakespeare, we have phrases being said all the time by Catholics, such as "by Our Lady," you know. But that's, of course, that's because it would be something in common usage. Because the English, as a good Catholic nation for well over 1,000 years, had this great devotion to the Blessed Virgin. So Shakespeare Catholic will say "by Our Lady." That's an obvious reference, but it should not necessarily be overstated, overemphasizing importance, because this is common usage, like saying, you know, "by God" or Jesus Christ, right? This is an invocation that was in common speech. But there were characters, for instance, like Portia in The Merchant of Venice, and even her name Portia, you know, from the Latin "porta," gate. One of the titles of the Blessed Virgin Mary, of course, Janua Coeli, gate of heaven. So Portia, the whole of The Merchant of Venice takes place on two levels. On the level of the city of man, Augustinian terms, city of man is Venice. That's where all the secular stuff's happening, all the avarice, anger, hatred, etc., lust. And then you have Belmont, this other level, the city of God, the beautiful mountain where the heavenly, she's called heavenly, where the heavenly Portia lives. And what's called for in that play is that the ascent, in both senses of the word, A-S-S-E-N-T, to say yes to, and A-S-C-E-N-T, to rise up towards. So the idea is to be edified and say yes to God, and ascend from the level of secularism, the city of man in Venice, to Belmont. So the Pisanio, that's what Pisanio does. That's what Antonio is called to. But Portia is always in Belmont. I mean, she descends as in disguise as the trial lawyer, in order to preach the mercy of God, and how, you know, without mercy, we're all going to face judgment. We're all in a bad place without mercy. So she preaches this, but she's always the heavenly Portia. So certainly, and for me, Portia is the most powerful in terms of just the force of her personhood, her personality, and also the most virtuous, the most powerful and the most virtuous of all of Shakespeare's characters, male or female. So that's the other thing we need to bear in mind, that Shakespeare certainly is not going to fall into some sort of feminist interpretation that he somehow belittles women. On the contrary, that, you know, he has many very powerful female characters, and the most powerful character of any of his plays, male or female, in my judgment, is Portia from The Merchant of Venice.
Another typical element of Catholic faith is purgatory. Can we find references to this truth of faith in Shakespeare's works?
Yes, indeed, and most explicitly, actually, again in Hamlet, because Shakespeare has the ghost of Hamlet's father as a soul from purgatory. That's stated explicitly, and I'll say a bit more about it. But this is very significant at the time, because about a year or so before Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, King James VI of Scotland, who will become King James I of England just about 3 years after Hamlet is written, writes a book called Demonology, about demons, and he gives what is the Protestant view of ghosts. And the Protestant view of ghosts is that they are always demonic. And the Catholic view is more nuanced. The Catholic view is that, well, they might be, but not necessarily. That the ghost might be a purgatorial soul who's maybe wandering as part of his purgatorial suffering. So Shakespeare, very significantly, bearing in mind that this book by James VI of Scotland had just been published and was well known, because very well known because he's the heir to the throne of England as well. So people are very interested in what he's doing and saying. So he writes this book, it's a Protestant view of ghosts, and Shakespeare responds by making his ghost, the ghost of Hamlet's father at the beginning of Hamlet, a soul who's from purgatory. Now, Hamlet doesn't take his word for it, because, of course, if the ghost is a demon, he could just be telling lies. So a large part of the play is Shakespeare, is Hamlet staging a play, The Mousetrap, which tended to do two things. either to prove that the ghost is honest, because the ghost says that my brother, your uncle, Claudius, murdered me in my sleep. And there's no witnesses. No one knows except the ghost. Well, if the ghost is a demon and he's telling lies, Hamlet goes and murders his uncle, who's an innocent victim of a demonic deception.
Yeah.
So Hamlet goes to great pains to find out whether the ghost is honest. So what he does, he stages a play, and the play is changed so that the murder in the play is a replica of poison being poured into the ear, which is what the ghost of Hamlet's father said was the way that he was killed by his brother, Claudius. So what's happening when the play is being staged, King Claudius is watching the play, and as King Claudius is watching the play, Hamlet is watching King Claudius to see how does King Claudius respond when his crime, which no one knows about except him, if he committed it, is reproduced in front of his eyes. And of course, when King Claudius sees his murder of his brother represented to him on the stage, he's shocked, he's horrified. He says, turn out the lights, and he storms out. And so, of course, then Hamlet has proven beyond any doubt that the ghost, as he puts it, an honest ghost. Well, an honest ghost is not a demon, right? If the ghost is honest, the ghost is who he says he was. He's in purgatory. Why is he in purgatory? Because he's murdered in his sleep before he can receive the last rites of the church. And the sacrament of extreme unction is illegal in England. Before he can be confessed, before he can receive absolution through confession, the sacrament of confessions also illegal in Elizabethan England. So and not receiving communion. It's also so the ghost says these three things. He died without confession, without extreme unction, without the benefit of receiving the sacrament. And of course, the Blessed Sacrament is also now banished from England, the doctrine of the real presence. So, so here we see Shakespeare, first of all, giving the Catholic understanding of ghosts in contradistinction to King James's Protestant view, Calvinistic view, but also showing that the honest ghost from purgatory is in purgatory, which again, the doctrine of purgatory is also denied in Shakespeare's England, is in purgatory because he has not received three of the sacraments of the church, which are banned. So this is a perfect example of Shakespeare showing his Catholicism through his plays.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you, Joseph, for this very interesting talk. And to our readers, I encourage you to delve into this book. I show you the cover again, The Day Shakespeare Died, by Hugh Ross Williamson. Of course, you can find this book on aroucapress.com. Thank you, Joseph, again. And until next time, may we all continue seeking truth with courage and faith. See you. Thank you.